While preparing to unleash the trailer for my movie on the world, which, by the way, coming soon, get excited, tell your friends, get your wallets ready, and join the Discord server I have for all my Pokemon stuff, link in the description, where there's also a Patreon if you want to throw me your hard-earned cash because you like me that much. Now that that's out of the way, while I was thinking about the movie trailer, is all I do, then I also thought about this incredibly interesting development in the world of Advance. Well, I shouldn't really be surprised by it, but it still is a little shocking. It's not a new development necessarily. This didn't just happen last week. You know, I generally think that about the old generations whenever people go, oh, is this team outdated? It's a couple months old. It's like, it's an old generation. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there are teams you could use from 10 years ago that would do just fine. Not to say that you can't optimize it for the present day, but, you know, you generally, Tyranitar and Metagross and Skarmory were just as good in Advance 10 years ago as they were 6 months ago as they were now. Well, vis-a-vis Tyranitar and Skarmory, that's exactly what this is about. Because ever since full 386 play existed in Gen 3, because when it started out, it was only Ruby and Sapphire, and the Pokedex was limited, so there was no T-Tar. And as soon as Fire Red and Leaf Green and XD and Coliseum came around, and unleashed all 386 Pokemon in existence, the metagame changed a lot, and Tyranitar became the undisputed number one in the tier because of how sand shapes everything. It was an undisputed fact. It was a truism. It was... the Earth is round. I know the Earth is actually flat, but, bear with me. I have to pretend. Yeah, Tyranitar was the round Earth of Gen 3 OU. But the flat Earthers have won, apparently. Or they're at least making some waves. Because this video is about the idea that many top players have, which is that Skarmory is in fact better than Tyranitar. Now, nobody is saying that Tyranitar's sand is not the single most shaping factor in Advance, because that you really can't say. That is extremely true, not up for debate. And every time, because if there's no sand, then... the Snorlax, Suicune run wild, Zapdos becomes unkillable, Celebi is ridiculous, things like that, But the point being is that Tyranitar sometimes only sets up sand for you, and that's so good to have that it's worth it. To just, sometimes you face a team with a bunch of stab, water, and ground, and fighting, and, Metagross's Meteor Mash, and you don't do anything with the T-Tar, because it's not that slow, it has all those bad weaknesses, etc., etc., etc. There's Heracross's Mega Horn flying around. Yeah, but even when Tyranitar itself does nothing, its sand limits Heracross. That's why you like T-Tar so much, right? Well, the new knowledge, relatively, this is... let's say about 2 years coming at this point, is that Skarmory is better than Tyranitar because it is a better game-to-game performer with just one set. Whereas Tyranitar, sometimes it's going to have a certain set and it's just going to thud into a certain team. And this Skarm number one argument basically says Skarm is a better performer than T-Tar, and that outweighs the sand T-Tar brings. Another important development in this is the idea that the things that you keep in check with T-Tar's sand stream, you don't necessarily need sand for. Because sometimes people will crutch on sand a little too hard. If sand is your counter to Suicune, for example, then dealing with Suicune early in the game before sand is up is really nightmarish. You see a bunch of teams just resorting to switching T-Tar into Suicune just to get the sand going, which, if that sounds insane, it kind of is, but it also makes sense. Because otherwise it's just ridiculous to handle. So people crutch on sand really hard. And it opens up team building opportunities if you find ways to deal with the sand affected Pokemon, the Suicunes, the Snorlaxes, the Celebes. If you have ways to deal with them that don't involve running the sometimes dead weight T-Tar, dead weight in terms of not, doing much in its own right, then you are able to, if you can cover those things, then you can diversify your team building. You can put more threatening Pokemon on average, and you're not going to run into those scenarios where T-Tar is outsped and destroyed or walled by the entire team, opposing team. And this has led to a lot of intriguing teams where suddenly you're stacking a lot faster threats. If you want to, the easy way to do it is just to run a lot of things like Metagross and Gengar, which you already like doing. You would run those alongside T-Tar, and then you kind of realize, hey, Metagross is handling Snorlax really well. Gengar helps out as well, alongside Skarmory. I mean, we'll get to that. The point of the Tarless teams is that you can run Skarmory without T-Tar to accentuate the spikes if you've got Metagross and Gengar and Zapdos for like Suicune, things like that. It opens up opportunities for you. So you can run something like Skarmory, Gengar, Metagross, Blissey, Zapdos, and the last can be, the last could be a T-Tar, but it also could be a million other things. So that's what, Aerodactyl could go in there to help out with Celebi. That's actually, a very good idea. So, just as an example, and that team does not have T-Tar, yet it doesn't really suffer for having it. I mean, you could make the argument, oh, well, things like Heracross get a little nastier to deal with, but your Gengar, for example, is also scary, and your Zapdos are scary to deal with because because you don't have Sand. So you create these kind of win-wins, where if the opponent brings Sand, fine, because they're going to be affected by it, and your Pokemon can deal with Sand as well. You've got your Skarm, your Metagross, or your Swampert, Blissey. I mean, Blissey becomes really obscene outside of Sand. And if they don't have Sand, then you are just fine. So, because before, there used to be this kind of team that would bring Skarm but no T-Tar, and would kind of cheat on T-Tar coverage, or on Sand coverage, as in they would count on the opponent bringing Sand for them. And with T-Tar's insane usage, that's obviously not the most unreliable strategy. But they would cheat on coverage against Zapdos and against Snorlax and Suicune, the two poster children for being Sand affected. And they would act like they had Sand on their team in their construction of the team, vis-a-vis dealing with Lax and Suicune, but they wouldn't. So then when they ran into something like a Snorlax or Suicune without Sand, then they were in trouble. So this new breed of Skarm teams without T-Tar is more a win-win situation, as opposed to a let me cheat on my coverage kind of situation. Like, if they bring Snorlax and Suicune without Sand, fine, I'm well equipped for them. The team on the screen that Arctic has right now is a good example. But if they do bring Sand, then I'm ready to deal with that as well. Of course I am. Why wouldn't I? It's advanced. So that kind of anti-Tar sentiment, coupled with just how obscene Skarmory is, and the fact that, because previously you would say, a lot of people would think, oh, well, you need T-Tar spikes alongside Skarmory, or T-Tar Sand alongside Skarmory spikes to make the spikes damage stick against things like Celebi. And the answer is not necessarily, if you've got your own Pokemon which thrive in a sandless environment. So, again, win-win. And that's the general idea of why some people think Skarm is better than Tar. You can run Skarm teams without Tar more easily, more efficiently. And you would say, okay, well, what about Tar teams without Skarm? Well, sure, there are plenty of offensive teams and balanced teams and what have you that T-Tar fits on that Skarm couldn't. However, this neglects the following. Skarmory teams, with or without T-Tar, just Skarmory teams in general, are the best in advance. This is, and I'm really not kidding with this, with the whole, flat earth thing. No, Skarmory teams are the best in advance, and this is a fact. This is, I understand that to a certain extent, Pokemon teams are, preference. Like, you can say, oh, well, sure, it's a fact that I don't know, so-and-so Pokemon is the best in so-and-so generation. But teams, isn't that more subjective? Like, yeah, okay, some teams are more consistent, but, to narrow it down this much, because it's not even like I'm saying Spike's teams, because, teams with Fortress and, other Spikers, like Cloyster, are not nearly as good. No, I'm specifically saying Skarmory in general, and this is a very common sentiment. So it's not just about the power of Spikes. It is about Skarmory in particular. Skarmory teams are the best. They are the most consistent. They have the best matchup spread against pretty much anything you want you're going to face. It is, and I'll give you an example in a second. They are the best against pretty much everything you're going to face. They're carried by Skarm's insane brokenness. And I'll put it this way. If you know that your opponent is going to bring Skarmory, what is the best course of action? Think about it for like 2 seconds, and your first instinct, oh, Magneton, free KO. It's like, okay, now build a Magneton team. Not to say there are bad Magneton teams, but you know what the best Magneton teams have? Also Skarmory. And sometimes you're thinking, well, the best, if I'm going to be running Skarmory anyway, then I can run Skarm Magneton, or I can run Skarm Spin with Claydol, sometimes Starmie. That's also very consistent. Or I can run Skarm or Skarm Offense, which doesn't really, which tries to overwhelm with Spike's pressure. So you don't really worry about the defensive aspect, the long-term game, even though you have to some extent, because that's what Skarm does. But, if you're running some sort of Skarm offensive team, your Mixmenses, Gengars, Aptoses, Calm Mind Jirachis, whatever, Arrows, then sure. But, or the last option is to, do a team like what Arctic has and what the second replay I have ready has, which is a team fully Spike. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be fully Spikes immune, but that's the general idea, stack as many Spikes immunes as you can. And I have a video called I forget the exact title, but Superman in Advance OU. If you want a more concrete course on what spikeless or spike avoiding teams in Advance do and look like. So now let me return to that whole Skarm teams are the best, most reliable thing. They are, because Skarm. Sorry about that, might just drop my laptop. Let me just make sure everything's still working fine. Yeah, I was just so excited about how Skarm is better than everything. Yeah, okay, so the most consistent advanced players spam the living daylights out of is very consistent at not just warding off opposing threats, although it does, but it also sets up your own threats. It does everything. You take hits, you make Dugtrio rue its existence, for example. Nothing worse than Skarm gets a spike early in the game, starts whirlwinding around. Oh, there's Dugtrio. Well, the game's won on the spot. I'm kidding. That's not true at all. But it's a very, very unpleasant position to be in. It's pretty much the only thing that. Oh, sorry, I was making sure the mic was okay there. Yeah, it's pretty much the only thing that makes Dugtrio, not just bearable, but like something you want to see. So, yeah, Skarmory teams are the best, most consistent, and this is true. Like, if you can have another opinion, but it is wrong. Everyone is entitled to opinions, of course, but some opinions are just correct. Like, yeah. I was about to go into one of my tangents, but I'm trying to keep a lid on those. Because I have a movie I want to see in a couple hours, and I want to actually make it. So, yeah, Skarm teams are the most spammed for a reason. And just in case you think, okay, well, that sounds ridiculous, please, the advanced alternative would love an alternative. It's like if you have some sort of secret, more consistent, better team style than Skarmory teams, let the world know. That will change Advance. But as it stands, and as it has stood pretty much forever, this is why the basic thing is new, because before T-Tar was always spammed alongside Skarmory, but the most consistent teams with T-Tar were Skarmory teams. So yeah, I mean, there was a while where Skarmory was less popular because people had this new generation idea carrying over into Advance, and thought Fortress was good. That was crazy. And then people started showing up with Skarmory and not caring about Fortress. It's like, yeah, why spin? Why bother with that horrible, horrible, unreliable strategy when you could just go with Skarmory and not care about anything because it deals with everything. That is the power of Skarm. Uh, now, again, not every team style is going to have Skarmory. Special offense could use Skarmory, but there are plenty of versions of special offense which would not be better with Skarmory. I'm not saying every team becomes better with Skarmory. And matter of fact, this is why I personally don't necessarily believe that Skarmory is the number one Pokemon in the tier. This is a school of thought that is now becoming more and more popular in the advanced world. That doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it. I don't fully disagree with it either. And the basic idea being that I think Tyranitar can be slapped on pretty much any team to improve it to more of an extent than Skarmory. Just barely. I mean, it is as neck and neck as you get, and I could go the other way for sure, and the fact that Sandstream is more impactful, and most of all, Tyranitar is an insane threat in and of itself. Not to say that Skarmory isn't. I know Skarmory is a defensive Pokemon, but it is a threat. It is, the most threatening Pokemon around, pretty much. Because T-Tar you deal with by hitting it with one of its many weaknesses, and it's, slow, not that bulky. Skarmory has the best typing imaginable, and stupid survivability. I mean, T-Tar is weak to Spikes and Dugtrio. Give me a break. And before you say, oh, well, Magaton, well, Dugtrio traps a lot more than just Skarmory. Than as Magneton does. Magneton does not trap the other steels nearly as reliably. Doesn't even reliably trap Fortress, and it has a quad effective HP fire on it, let alone anything else. So that is why I just barely think Tyranitar is better. But Skarmory is number two. Ranking Skarmory any lower than number two in your viability rankings is also just wrong. Absolutely wrong. Um, on the flip side, I also think ranking T-Tar lower than number two is, also wrong. But they are the top two. And then I made a video about my viability rankings for advanced for this year. But Blissey, I think, is number three. I don't remember. It should be. It's got to be up there. Blissey's also crazy broken. And now you start to say, hey, that's starting to sound familiar. Skarmory and Blissey together and T-Tar. It's like, yeah, well, welcome to the most consistent form of team in advance. The most consistent Skarm teams also have Blissey. But, and here's why you see the Skarm number one argument. Because, yeah, you can take off the T-Tar, you can take off the Blissey, but as soon as you take off the Skarmory, you have a less reliable team. You have a less. Now, I'm not saying less reliable means bad. For example, I love special offense. I think special offense is very good. And it's one of the more consistent team styles in advance. But it's never going to be at the consistency of a Skarmory team. That is the whole point. Skarm is the apex of consistency. And to and again, your opponent is using Skarm. Your answer is not to beat Skarm in and of itself, or else it'd be as easy as using Magneton. It's going to be to beat the Skarmory team, and that is the challenge. Because if you beating a Skarmory team is the most difficult thing to do in advance, because they are the best. They have the widest reach. They beat everything much more reliably than any other team style. And again, I would love if someone proposed like an alternative that is more consistent, but it does not exist in the current form of advance. I'm sure if we drop down an Uber or something, then it would be weird. Actually, because I think Fortress is more preferred than Skarmory and Uber's because of its neutrality to Thunder, which is everywhere. I could be misremembering that though. And Skarmory's still amazing in Ubers, of course. But yeah, that is the basic tenet of this Skarm better than Tar movement. And I mean, and Skarm in and of itself, it's just so crazy broken. It's you're really only threatening it with stab, fire, or electric. Because everything else, it shrugs off. It's immune to sand and spikes and toxic. It has resistances to everything. Like it resists psychic. To say nothing of like its earthquake immunity, but the psychic resistance is absolutely huge. It resists most physical moves like mash and HP flying, double edge. You know, it's neutral to rock and fighting. That's true. By the way, rock and fighting are two of the best offensive types in the game because they're the only physical types that hit Skarmory neutrally. To my recollection, I hope I'm not forgetting something. But yeah, I mean the quadruple weakness to or weakness, resistance to Mega Horn, things like that. Yeah, it's lunacy. Because even if you do hit it hard with like a CB focus punch or something, I mean, if you were paying attention to that replay in the other game, how many focus punches from T-Tar did that Skarmory take? Like a million, and it just shrugged it off. It protected because even if you get Skarmory down to low health, it will find a way in, and it's going to start. It's going to heal and protect. Just squeezes every ounce. Like anyone who's played Advanced knows that Swampert can be famously unkillable sometimes because of Protect and Scar. And imagine that, but you're immune to spikes, which is why Defensive Flygon is amazing, by the way. So yeah, ludicrous survivability, ludicrous typing, ludicrous bulk, and in return, Skarmory is a threat. Spikes are very good offense in a generation where the power level is not that high, relative to later gens. There's a saying that this is not 100% true, but most good offense in advance comes from passive damage or accentuated by trapping, and you can combine them, of course. Skarmory Magneton teams are wonderful. But again, you can. It's like the take out the T-Tar, take out the Blissey, take out the Magneton, throw in something else. Fine. Take out the Skarmory, you have a worse team. So this is why I'm very sympathetic to the argument. Now, uh, I mentioned T-Tar being a big threat, and that might sound like, oh yeah, well, duh. But it's not that well done nowadays, and I know that sounds crazy, but people tend to forget that T-Tar is a threat because they use it so much just because of the sand. It's and this is why the Skarm over Tar movement is good, even if you don't agree with it, because it opens your mind up. Because before, people would just throw T-Tar on a team with Skarm because, well, I need sand. There were a lot of the same players who would say, or who now say Skarm is better than Tar. They were the same people who say T-Tar needs to be on every team, 100% usage, stuff like that, just for the sand. And so it's funny to see those opinions shift. But that was common wisdom. Maybe not that 100% usage, but certainly on more teams than not. More GSC Snorlax than not GSC Snorlax. So and then, once you start realizing, oh, I don't need T-Tar on every team, then your options open up. And this also leads to people appreciating T-Tar more in its own right. Because, again, people were just using it as a sand machine, and they almost didn't care what the set was. And they accepted, hey, well, sometimes T-Tar is not going to be that threatening, and that's fine. That's, the price you pay for sand, and it's totally worth it. And then people almost kind of forgot, like, oh yeah, but this is also one of the most threatening Pokemon in the game, and that has almost led to a resurgence in T-Tar being dangerous, and which sounds hilarious, I know. But once you realize, oh, this thing is absurdly scary, then you realize, yeah, in my case anyway, and most others, I think the majority opinion is still that T-Tar better than Skarm. If you look at the latest viability ranking submissions, for example. Uh, and this is not just a default sand is better than spikes thing, or sand is more fitting on more teams or whatever. But it's that T-Tar provides so much amazing utility with every set in and of the set's own right, as opposed to just because haha sand. But again, I mentioned Skarmory as a threat a couple times, and that is absolutely the case. Switching to Skarmory is nightmarish. There was a period in advance where everyone started spamming refresh just because they were so terrified of Skarmory's toxic. And like Swampert's toxic and Blissey's toxic and Gengar's will, of course. But Protect Toxic Skarmory was public enemy number one. People wanted it banned. Some people still want it banned, but that's another discussion. So it's not just toxic, of course. Whirlwind with sand and spikes, that can be nightmarish. It's and even Drill Peck, and you think, okay, come on, calm down, Kev. Skarm Drill Peck is not threatening. I agree in a vacuum, but
and I'm not just saying this because Drill Peck is beating down this Aerodactyl right now. It's because Toxic is doing this as well. No, Drill Peck makes it so that the Toxic immune Gengar cannot switch into Skarm freely. That was previously Skarm's one weakness. That with Spike's Toxic, Whirlwind Protect, it did a whopping 0% to Gengar, and you would have to deal with a protracted Gengar assault as the downside of using Skarmory. And then once you start using Drill Peck on it, also to defeat Refresh Claydol and Touch Fortress for a little damage to sit on you, then all those matchups change, and suddenly dealing with Skarm is a lot tougher because previously it's like, okay, you can't overwhelm Skarm, so you outlast it. But you don't want to necessarily go full stall, rest and whatnot to do that. And so you use more offensive measures, and with Drill Peck, Skarm cuts down on those offensive measures. Another one, people would say, okay, well, Spike's Toxic Protect Whirlwind, terrifying set, of course, but it doesn't do any attacking damage, so you just spam Focus Punch with things like Heracross. There was a set McMegan came up with, Swords Dance Focus Punch, Oko Skarmory. And yeah, as soon as Skarmory runs Drill Peck again, then forget that. Same with like something like Breloom. So yeah, or Focus Punch Snorlax. That was another one. And so Drill Peck Skarmory is not necessarily the threat, but it deletes so much would be counterplay. Um, what was the last one that I have? Oh yeah, it can also run Thief to great effect to neuter the opposing Skarmory or just something in general, and steal some leftovers. Yeah, so all in all, Skarmory does it all. So even if you do not necessarily agree with Skarm being better than T-Tar, it is a worthwhile viewpoint to consider. Thank you for watching slash listening. I hope this was enjoyable slash informative for you, and I will see you in the next one. Or on Discord, link in the description.